Hello folks, welcome back to our recorded lectures for HI 237. This is the Vikings abroad, traders, raiders, and everything in between. So today, as promised, we are finally moving into talking about the Vikings in a European context. That being said, we are not leaving behind our quest to explode all stereotypes. That is still going to be something that is at the forefront of our minds throughout this whole next section of the course. So what I want to do before we start looking at the nitty-gritty of the history is to look at why their movement into Europe, however you want to term it, happened. What drove them to expand their horizons. That brings us back to historiography too, as one of the things that scholars of this period love to do is to come up with conclusive reasons why the Viking Age or Viking Ages happened. It is not obviously that simple, and it certainly is never going to be conclusive. So we established fairly early on in this course that the Viking raids could not be seen as part of an anti-Christian war against southern Europe. So what were they? Should we be using the terms raids uncritically? Of course not. We should never be using any term uncritically. It is not trading or raiding. It is often trading and raiding at different times depending on the context of the situation. Trading can lay the groundwork for raiding, and vice versa. Now, that being said, it is possible to divide potential causes for the Viking expansion into Europe into a few different categories. So I'll just run through them quickly here, and then we will look at them in more depth. So demographic determinism, so population pressures, economic determinism, looking for wealth, technological determinism. We could, so we did. Environmental determinism, one of our favorites. The climate made us do it, I suppose, if I had to sum it up. Political determinism, looking for greener grass. And ideological determinism. That one is going to take a little bit more explanation. I just want to pause for a moment so you guys can admire the Viking cake wedding topper that I found to illustrate this slide. It is so darn cute. I really want one. Anyways, horn helmets and all, I want one. Demographic determinism is the most classic or traditional explanation for the Viking raids. So the argument here is basically that population pressure led to shortage of land, and that there was a problem with the quantity of arable land in Scandinavia. And to be fair, this is true in some areas, certainly in places like Western Norway, but there is no suggestion that there was overwhelming population pressure in other regions of Scandinavia. So if there's no evidence for this, where does it come from? Surprise, this idea comes from our sources. It actually goes all the way back to the classical concept that Scandinavia was, quote, a hive of nations. So, for instance, Adam of Bremen, writing in the 11th century, tells us that the landless men of Scandinavia sort of just bubbled up out of this hive of nations and became raiders. Dudo of St. Quentin, whom you read for today, also argued that Scandinavia was a hive of nations and that this sort of raiding activity was a way to get rid of the restless, demanding types who couldn't be trusted to stay quietly at home and not disturb society. Now, of course, his reasons for saying so were somewhat more complex because he's writing from a Norman context, and so we'll look at that in detail at the Zoom session. Now, more significantly, though, there's a historiographical influence here that we're perhaps not seeing that needs acknowledging. What gets wrapped up in the demographic explanation is this underlying assumption that the Scandinavians slowly colonized neighboring territories, sort of in a wave of advance. You can actually trace the origins of this back to ideas about late antiquity and the movement of non-Roman peoples towards the end of the Western Empire. Now, one of the traditional explanations of the so-called barbarian invasions is that these peoples were simply born to move for whatever reason. But as my original professor who taught me about that period used to say, people are not migratory. They have reasons to move. So this poses a source problem in a different way. Sources from Iceland and Norway after the Viking Age make the assumption that early settlements existed in the Northern Islands, so like the Shetlands and the Orkneys. So they portray this advance of colonization as a progressive sort of thing. And the problem, of course, is that there's no firm evidence, either documentary or archaeological, for settlement there until after the mid-9th century, at which point you already have Scandinavian armies spending the winter in Ireland, England, and Francia. Now, is it impossible that such northern settlements existed in the early period? Of course not. It's entirely possible that they did, but we can't establish it as probable with a hard evidence. So we are going to be looking at some that might lean in that direction in the next lecture, but again, the timing is a bit off. Now, all of my negative opinions on this explanation aside, there is one demographic element that probably needs some discussion. So if you look at female graves in Western Norway from this period, you see a lot of insular goods, so stuff from England and Ireland. Earlier Iron Age female graves also had a lot of grave goods. So is this bride wealth? Some scholars actually suggest that the raiding was meant to give young men the opportunity to accumulate cash so they could buy a home and accommodate the bride price. Now, there is also some evidence for female infanticide in pre-Christian Scandinavia. Possibly sons were preferred over daughters because of military needs, but that would have led to an imbalance in the population. Hence, greater competition for the women who were there, higher bride prices, more need to accumulate wealth. It's something that's worth more thought, but really the earliest Viking activity seems to have been about seeking wealth, not about seeking land. So, here we see scholars turning to economic determinism. If you look at Viking activity from the perspective of piracy, the fact is that Western Europe was experiencing a commercial revival in the 8th century, and it would have been tempting, because what we see are major trading centers developing. So places like Dorstadt on the Rhine, Quentavik near Boulogne, Hamwick, which is eventually going to become Southampton, Fordwich, which is the port of Canterbury, London, Ipswich, York. Scandinavia and the Baltic had commodities that the South wanted, as I've mentioned before. Amber, whale products, fish, furs, all kinds of stuff like that. So they also had trading centers of their own appear. Places like Birka and Hedeby. These are central points at which these northern goods could be gathered. Now, you can also make an argument that the trading contacts allowed for intelligence to be gathered. When you trade with someone, you gather information about them, and information about how they operate in their own lands and about their defenses. Having established that this wealth was there, opportunism could be a potential explanation. The Scandinavians see the wealth of these other societies, and so they took it. Now, speaking of wealth, there is a case to be made from the archaeological evidence that in the late 8th and early 9th century, you see what we might call a silver rush in Northern Europe. We have evidence of large numbers of Islamic silver coins reaching Scandinavian settlements in northwest Russia and the Baltic. It's like insignificant numbers. This means that there was extensive trade between Scandinavia and the East. They're Abbasid coins, so we are talking about the Caliphate. Was it direct trade? Maybe, maybe not, but they're at least tied into the trading networks as a whole. Otherwise, the silver would not have gotten there in such quantities. Now, the influence of the silver rush is a long-time economic theory regarding the origins of raiding, but there are differences of opinions. Did the availability of silver coins, and so the concentration of wealth, encourage raiding, or was it the periodic lack of availability of such coins due to, financial and political fluctuations in the Arab world that drove the increase in raiding? And there is a regional issue here as well. Eastern Scandinavia certainly could have been reacting directly to this, but what about the western regions? Again, this evidence is from northwest Russia and the Baltic, not western Scandinavia. There's also a substantive difference in the nature of raiding in West versus East. Western raiding tended not to be against urban centers in the early period. They focused on monasteries and rural settlements. If the raiders were from Western Norway, they were likely rural themselves, so they're going to raid the type of settlement they understand. Walled cities are another matter entirely. So regional variation, as always, is critically important to recognize. Now, I've bundled these two together because I find them problematic in similar ways. Both types of determinism remove, or at least minimize, the human role in decision-making, and so I've never been fond of them. Now, certainly both technology and environmental conditions can have an impact on human decision-making, but we're not at the total mercy of either yet. Now, technological determinism, in this case, what is meant by this is naval technology and seafaring knowledge, which are seen as one of the driving forces of the Viking Age. It's a very traditional explanation for the beginning of raiding. But I mean, just as we've discussed in a past lecture, Scandinavians didn't start building ships suddenly in the 8th century. So you can't clearly point to this as a reason for the beginning of the raids. Now, with environmental determinism, usually people point to what's called the medieval warm period, and they talk about Greenland actually being green back then, which is, how do we say simplistic? Simplistic. The medieval warm period in and of itself is problematic to talk about. I actually dealt with it in great detail. I taught a course a number of years back about the environmental history of the Middle Ages. And the medieval warm period gets a lot of strange baggage attached to it. You get a lot of people today saying, oh, well, look, temperatures were as warm in the Middle Ages as they were today, and it was all fine afterwards. And the problem, of course, is that the medieval warm period was not a global phenomenon, and temperatures do not appear to have been as warm in that period. Now, there's a lot of regional variation about the medieval warm period. There's disagreement as to when the warming trend actually started. There is contradictory evidence for an early cooling trend in the Carolingian period, possibly because of volcanic eruptions. And when it comes right down to it, there's a major difference between climate and weather. If nothing else, Norse settlement in Iceland starts well after the early raids, Greenland even later. So it's questionable to say that climate provided the opportunity to raid, because if it did, why didn't they take it sooner? So as you can see, there are some holes here when using either of these as potential explanations for the Viking Age. That's not to say they're not influences. I certainly think they might have been. I mean, the development of naval technology would have allowed them to go places that they hadn't been able to go in the Bronze Age, and the medieval warm period might have encouraged them to travel and settle in places that might otherwise have been less attractive. But I don't think that either of these can be considered the major driving force. So there we go. What I think needs to be looked at in much more detail is the concept of political determinism. These arguments tend to include discussion of both push and pull factors, as scholars call them. So pull factors are episodes of political unrest, in this case that cause Scandinavian raiders to target given areas. Push factors are where you have the centralization of power within Scandinavian kingdoms that leaves some looking elsewhere to establish power bases. Now, there is a problem with the idea of pull factors in this case. The raiding starts in England and in continental Europe at times when areas that are being attacked are quite strong and centralized. I mean, Offa of Mercia is ruling around the first time of the first raids, and Offa was an enormously powerful Anglo-Saxon king. He's one of a small group that the sources call Bretwalda, which implies some form of overlordship over other Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. We don't know as much about him as we'd like because the Great Army, decades later, hits Mercia very hard, and many of our sources for its history are presumably destroyed. But Offa is someone who felt comfortable jousting diplomatically with Charlemagne, so that does say something. Now, on the continent at the end of the 8th century, you've got, Charlemagne. was a massively powerful military leader. Now, to be fair, in Francia, certainly, raiding does intensify when the Carolingian Empire begins to destabilize, and we'll look at that in another lecture. But you can't say the raid started as a direct result. That's putting the cart before the horse. The destabilization comes much later, 2 full generations later, and has much more to do with Carolingian politics than it does with their particular Viking problem. Now, what about Scotland and Ireland? Well, at the outset of raiding, their political situations probably looked pretty much like what the Vikings were used to at home. We'd have many small competing kingdoms, nothing to justify calling them a softer target. And in fact, with Celtic societies having the same warrior ethos as the Scandinavians, it would have been quite challenging in some ways. Now, push factors are rather more compelling. This idea includes the concept that the work of Harald Fairhair in Norway, where he centralized the kingdom, caused a diaspora. This comes directly from our medieval Scandinavian sources. There's something fairly specific and confident about the way our sources talk about this. Now, it cannot explain all raiding, certainly not the type we see before Harald begins to work, but it does provide a legitimate possibility. Certainly the Scandinavians did need to react to the centralization of their neighbors, in particular the Carolingians, who were of course a real threat. And the Carolingians may actually have provided a model. They would have shown the Scandinavians the benefits of centralized power, and also the useful role of plunder in maintaining a military following. Areas in the west could even provide havens, training grounds for exiles. We have some examples of Viking raiders who were leaders of various sorts, including exiled princes. Now, you could build a power base through raiding. The wealth you accumulated didn't have to be devoted to buying a house or a wife, but could also be redistributed to your followers to create a stronger warband of your own. So, while political exiles, push factors may have been a driving force for many, other political considerations were at work as well. And our last one. So here we get back to cultural issues, and I'm just going to give you a quote. This is from Neil Price's The Viking Way. We are left with a sobering conclusion, which is that the Vikings created one of the few known world mythologies to include the preordained and permanent ruin of all creation and all the powers that shaped it, with no lasting afterlife for anyone at all. Everything will burn at the Ragnarok, whatever gods or humans may do. The outcome of our actions, our fate, is already decided, and therefore does not matter. What is important is the matter of our conduct as we go to meet it. The psychological implications of this and other aspects of Norse religion bear thinking about. So the argument here is that Vikings were driven by honor and fatalism. Raiding is quite risky. Your survival is not at all guaranteed, but that's okay. Now, why were they willing to risk so much, according to the proponents of this school? I don't really buy this, at least not as a major issue. I think too much emphasis gets put on the traditional Viking stereotype. What do you guys think? Think about that for a minute. I'm going to ask you that at the Zoom session as well. And in general, what should we think about the motivations for the movement into Europe? Okay, so we're going to tackle those documents in much more depth at the Zoom session, and I will be back shortly with the other lecture for this week. Thanks very much.